This is 10 Questions. I'm Andy Johnson. In a column in the Express, in the Sunday Express on June 4th, Noble Phillips said this, among the things he talked about. The Madia tragedy in Guyana demonstrates that the outrageous treatment of marginalized women continues. The indigenous people account for approximately 10% of Guyana's population, but are spread over 80% of its landmass. Almost 44% of their homes do not have electricity. Transportation is poor and young people have little means of knowing about the world. They grow up speaking one of the indigenous languages, but are confronted with English and unfamiliar cultural experiences when they go to school. School dropouts are typical in the hinterlands and happen at 2 points, at transition from primary to secondary school and during secondary school. Poverty is endemic. There's no money to buy medicine and children go to school hungry. 1 in every 4 indigenous children is stunted, creating real risks to their cognitive and physical development. He says other things. The point he was making about putting in context what is called the Madia tragedy, in which 20 young people perished in a fire set by one of the girls in that facility because of a disagreement between her and the lady whom she worked with. The question is, this is the second edition of our attempt to try and understand what happens there and how people are dealing with, how they should be dealing with it. And our guest on this edition of the program is Nidhi Kirpalani, a counseling and clinical psychologist. Good to have you on.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. So let me just ask you, when I approached you about having this discussion, what may have been the things you've been thinking about, reading about this incident?
Well, firstly, this is an issue that not even is happening in Trinidad, it's happening in Guyana, but we as a nation, as a world, experience trauma. Ourselves in Trinidad have experienced traumatic experiences. We have experienced fires, and these things could have effects on us. Just when we watch the news, when we know a friend, or in the past we've experienced things, this is what we call vicarious trauma. So sometimes, it's triggering. Also knowing that this is happening in another nation, we know it could happen here. In fact, we do have indigenous people here. We have many different cultures. We have people who feel like they're losing their culture, acculturation. We have even the Venezuelans who, there's a whole debate. Do they have to lose their language and speak only English? Do we as a nation have to, all those sorts of things really do come into play. And it's very relatable.
Yeah, vicarious trauma. First time I heard the term, it means that is just the stuff that happens based on all living our lives. Some of the incidents that happen.
So there's different types of trauma. Vicarious trauma is it's not happening directly to me. So this didn't happen directly to us, but I can experience. You have been through a traumatic experience, and I can understand that is actually painful. I feel almost that pain. So, for example, in 9/11, this is a worldwide event, but so many persons experienced symptoms of trauma. They felt lost, they cried, they mourned. Maybe even persons would have had a lot of fear of going into elevators or big buildings. Vicarious trauma is that I experienced it even though it did not directly happen to me.
Yeah, and what are some of the ways in which people deal with that?
Well, first off, is actually recognizing that we've experienced trauma. So there's many symptoms of trauma. And in a traumatic experience doesn't mean I have to have experienced trauma. Trauma is very individual. It means that I have perceived, I feel like this is traumatic to me. So another individual may not feel as traumatized as I have. It could be psychological, it could be physical harm, it could be emotional harm, it could be any sort of event that occurred that I deem as traumatic. And then maybe it is that I am having, if I experience trauma, maybe I'm having flashbacks. In the middle, I might smell something, for example, smoke. I smell smoke, and then it instantly triggers that memory of being in a fire. And my whole body has what we call a visceral reaction. It is acting as if I'm actually in that fire, even if it's for a split second. I'm actually feeling as if I'm there, and my body tenses up. You know, it could be unconscious or conscious. I could be having nightmares, panic attacks. It's just difficulty engaging in regular everyday activities that probably I was engaging in before.
Right. So I spoke with an attorney on the last edition of the program about this incident, because I started off trying to find out how does the people, I'm talking here about the people in Guyana generally, but inside of this, that attorney, as well as Mr. Philip, was making the point about who the person is who is at the center of this, that she's a member of this indigenous community, or one of them in Guyana, and that they have there's a whole set of other considerations socioeconomically, psychologically, about such people in a society, and that we have to look at that to the same extent that we look at the incident itself. But my thing was to try and find out how does a country, how do the people grieve in a situation like this? The government established sort of 3 days of national mourning. The question is whether that is enough and what will follow that.
So saying that we have 3 days of mourning is one thing to, you know, bond persons together, but how are we actually coping with trauma? It's about learning how to not just cope, but to positively cope with the stress, with the trauma, with the feelings, that panic that goes on. And that means coming up with healthy coping strategies. Of course, there's some persons who experience trauma and we say, all right, let me go take a drink. I mean, we as a society do that a lot. Forget that now, don't talk about it, you know, just it don't happen. Those are not necessarily always healthy coping strategies. Or she's too young, she'll forget if it's a young child. But the truth is our body still stores it and it has to go somewhere. So as a clinical and counseling psychologist, it is about what we recommend is finding those positive positive coping strategies. And that can be helpful by having psychologists, mental health therapists all get involved, whether it is that somebody can publicly say that, you know, these are some healthy coping strategies, such as maybe you need some time to rest, maybe you go and seek your religious, whatever your spiritual faith is, maybe you take some, maybe you go see a mental health professional and talk about these things. And also we know that there's ways to learn from reading about those things. So we have media here, we have news articles that can actually say, okay, these are a list of healthy coping strategies. These are signs to look out for. And maybe these are a list of mental health professionals in your area that can help if you need. They have social workers, psychologists, school counselors, all those persons.
Yeah. How important do you think to the issue is the fact that so these are young people, those who perished, and others in a community that is an indigenous, but it is in a minority community. And the point both that attorney was making and Mr. Philip is that we have to start with the fact that such people do not enjoy the best of services and whatever else the country offers because they are indigenous.
And that's a real shame. So, I mean, at a higher level, if it is that you have the ability to send persons into that area to address these needs, then that's great. We have Red Cross that goes into different areas of the world and deals with the physical attributes of trauma. We have Green Cross, and they also exist in Trinidad, which go in after and deal with the psychological trauma that occurs after a critical incident. So, to say that you say, okay, even grab volunteers, even reach out to those organizations that can provide to those indigenous communities. And then there's ways in working with persons despite their language. So for example, even if you speak Spanish and I speak English, there's ways of maybe we have an interpreter, maybe we have somebody from those indigenous groups who can help translate the language and they're willing to do so. There are also non-verbal therapeutic techniques that technically don't need words to be able to find how healing occurs. There's many avenues if you really contact persons who have the background and the skills and allow them. Maybe it's just facilitation of guiding those therapists. Look, we need you here. What do you need? All the lawyers, the medical professionals, and guiding them to this area.
Yeah. One of the things that Mr. Phillips says in the piece is that to charge this young lady is to absolve everyone else over their shortcomings as to what led to what happened.
So I don't think I could comment on the law and what Guyanese law says towards that case. However, it is a whole multidisciplinary case that we'd look at. You know, what caused this? It's a young girl.
Yeah.
In any case, the neuroscience shows us that there's no full brain development until about age 21 to 25. So we're talking about a teenager who does not have rational, logical thinking in her capability, because biologically, this front part of her brain, called the prefrontal cortex, isn't even fully developed. So she herself did not make a fully adult, mature, logical decision. What caused her to act so irrationally? I mean, even if, no matter what, I'd still encourage that she's able to find that that support, that mental health support, to learn how to grow. Because of course, you know, now being charged with murder, I'm sure that was not her intention. Well, not sure, but hopefully that wasn't her intention, and it was more out of rage. Teenagers, sort of like toddlers in terms of the brain development, they respond very emotionally and very quickly and very rationally, very impulsively. So it could have been a very impulsive thing. I am angry, and this is what I'm going to do. It's not always rational.
And you think that some of that understanding, some of that reality will have to feature in the trial that she's up against? Those are things that presumably her defense will want to put forward for consideration by the system, the justice system?
These are neurobiological facts that the full brain is not developed. So it would be helpful even in terms of how you treat with that child post-trial. That is more what I would aim for. You know, even in terms of not post-trial, but from now, how is that child dealt with in terms of, are they able to access care, or is she only treated like a villain, like a murderer? Is she put in a, you know, is she treated poorly and cast aside and treated bad? Because yes, this was a horrible incident. It was very horrible what happened. Even infrastructurally, I think I've read in one of the two articles that they weren't trained in how to escape from the fire. There was no fire drill training. What is it that we can learn from the entire event so that in going forward, many things can be put in place? Anger management techniques, emotional intelligence techniques, coping strategies, what to do when children are engaging with, I believe it was an older man. You know, how is it that devices are regulated in such systems? There's many things to learn from this and actually implement. You
think that the man involved, because Mr. Philip made that point, we haven't heard anything about addressing the situation with the man involved. Do you think that is something that is an imperative?
So in Trinidad and Tobago, the law is that a minor is under the age of 18. So if you're engaging in a sexual relationship with a minor, that is against the law. There is a rape charge. There is a sexual assault charges and sexual abuse charges that can be laid on that person. So how it is integrated in the legal system, that person should be addressed, because either way, this is against the law, this is wrong. We have so many children in Trinidad and Tobago who experience sexual abuse, and you don't see the perpetrators being held accountable for their actions. So if I, as a human being, am not held accountable for my actions, that is almost like, whew, it's a relief. It's a dopamine release. That dopamine release means it's okay, I didn't get caught, it is probably okay, maybe I could do it again. Maybe I'll learn how to do it. Perpetrators can re-perpetrate and go and abuse other persons. So yes, definitely.
Interesting, the little I know of the subject, that comes back to mind, a dopamine release. It means that your body, or is it your brain, releases stuff in you that is equivalent to taking something.
Yeah, so those in our brain, we have certain neurochemicals. So cortisol is a stress hormone. Dopamine releases those good, happy feelings. For example, if I like exercising, and if I go for an exercise, if I go for a run or to the gym, I feel good. If I go to yoga, I feel good. It makes me feel good. Whereas in a stressful event, a lot of cortisol is being released, and I feel more stress. So there's a relationship between the neurochemical and the the emotion, that feeling. It is within what we call the emotional brain or the limbic system.
Okay, we're going to take a break. We'll be back in a moment. Stay with us. Nidhi Kripalani, counseling and clinical psychology. We're looking again at the situation in Guyana. 20 young people died in a fire set by one of the young ladies who was in that facility. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the program. We're looking again at the Madhya incident, the incident in Guyana a couple of weeks ago in which 20 young people in a home died because of a fire set by one of them, a teenage young lady who got angry because one of the authorities in the facility took away her cigarette lighter. Was her phone, yes. Her cell phone, sorry about that. So the question is whether or not 3 days of mourning will do it, or what is the work that has to take place after that? And as far as your experience will tell you, that work is ongoing as we speak.
So now we're talking about grief. There is no time period for grief. One of the first questions I get when I get a client in my private practice is, how long will this take? How many sessions? That is so individualistic because we each have our own lives, our own likes, dislikes, our own personal history, our trauma history, our own stressors, So think of it like grief also can be really big. Like as if I had a blow-up ball, it can get really big as soon as it happens, and then maybe I'll cope for a little while. So if somebody dies, or when somebody dies, we have all this support. Often the family comes around, everybody's coming over, we have people coming and bringing food, and all that happens, and we have the funeral. And then there's a sudden shift. Nobody's around anymore. And there's a whole different life going on. I have to live every day now with this person not here. I might be like, hey, so-and-so. And then I'm like, no, wait, that person doesn't exist anymore in this physical realm. So
and sometimes the reality of the departure only happens when all that gathering has done. 2-3 days after the funeral, when you begin, the reality comes back to you.
Yeah, and not only 2-3 days. Sometimes it happens even years later.
And you get flashbacks and so on.
You get flashbacks. Imagine somebody who's lost a parent. Throughout their whole life, they can experience the mourning of that. It can be bigger and then it gets smaller. So it's like an expanding ball, and so sometimes the grief is manageable, and we're like, okay. But then something happens, and boom, it's Father's Day coming up soon, and oh my gosh, I don't have my father here. And that brings up emotions, that's hurt. Oh, I remember that time, or what he could, or those sorts of things. Grief is like an expanding and closing ball that lasts almost a lifetime.
Yeah, so Mr. Phillips says in this piece here, we already know the fundamental direct shortcomings of this horrible incident. We already know how officialdom can hide the truth, and a plan is needed to avert the ongoing social and economic tragedy plaguing life in these places. That to me, the fundamental question. He says that officialdom sometimes, probably unwittingly, as much as maybe wittingly, hides the truth.
Well, the truth is very difficult because you have many different versions of the truth. You have that girl's version that she might have shared or been allowed to share. You might have the staff, the teachers, you might have even the other children there. Each person can have their version of the truth. And to say your version is not that version all the time is sometimes very difficult to see. Your version is not true. It's seeing it through your lens. We're seeing it through a 15-year-old girl's lens. You took my phone. I was unable to be in touch with maybe it's the person that she loves and is most connected to. This is her support system. we don't know details of that. So she now feels disconnected. When we talk about the Maslow hierarchy of needs, which is what we talk about, it's a little triangle drawing of showing what are the basic needs a human being needs. They have changed it from food, shelter, clothing and sex to food, shelter, clothing, sex, and Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi has become...
So that has been included. So Maslow has sort of been reconfigured.
Yes, it has, because Wi-Fi is so necessary. Imagine how we would have even worked or communicated during COVID if we had none of that.
Yeah, you see a lot of people now, they can't do without their mobile devices, can't do without it at all. People just
and
married to it in a lot of cases.
In some cases, it's even an addiction. In some cases, it's manageable. And that affects, it can affect us personally. It can affect our social skills. It can even affect our sleep patterns. There's negatives and positives to being so connected. And teenagers, they're in a stage of, their developmental stages, I need to connect. I need to figure out who I am in this world. And sometimes, a lot of the times, it is through connecting to others on devices.
And it's very early in the day yet for this incident. Just a couple of weeks have passed. What do you think, what is the process by which, at some point, what is the point you think at which the authorities would have gotten it under their belt, and that the real release and the real program and progress for all the people involved here could be taken into account? When will that time come when we'll say, well, people will say, well, okay, so enough time has passed, we've crossed the Rubicon on it?
That is so individual. That is for each person to see. We're also talking about students who lost their lives, family who lost a loved one, teachers and students who witnessed other persons in that family and in their school die. It's very traumatic. So all those things is very individualistic. Social services, however, I'd say be put in place once medical needs are met, meaning a person is no longer in critical medical care. We can implement social services one time, but we don't. Social services, psychologists, therapists, social workers don't necessarily intervene if it is that medical doctors. So those in critical care in the hospital still would not be recommended directly for social services. But once it is that they're cleared of their medical health, then definitely go in one time and send the social services, send persons to investigate. All these things should be very immediate, because the story changes as my perception changes. So if I'm 15, as I grow older, I turn 18, 19, my prefrontal cortex develops, my outlook in life, who I am socially, it all changes. So it is very normal and natural that trauma after trauma, that the story kind of changes. You lose bits and pieces. You understand it through different lens.
It's possible that, so police investigators come and take statements from people in the immediacy of whatever the incident is. And sometimes 6 months, 9 months down the road, the narrative changes because people have just, sort of relaxed and seeing things differently. Sometimes that happens. At times that happens.
The trauma narrative does change. That's because I might forget things. And sometimes people are like, how you could forget? Oh, but, I've asked somebody, so what did you do yesterday? And they're like, I forget.
Yeah.
Something
you
so
remember
simple.
what you did a month ago. But
yes. Memory is such a strange thing. It's such a beautiful thing as well. And the brain wants to heal. It wants to heal. It wants to, explore things and recover. It does not want to live in a constant state of negative emotion and negative thoughts. So the story can change. Not all the time does it, but it's very likely that we see it through a new lens, yes?
And in a lot of cases, such as these and others, that there is a responsibility or duty on the part of the authorities to get to the point where charges are laid almost immediately. But very often, it sort of circumvents the real process by which you come to a determination as to what to charge. Mm-hmm. It is from what Mr. Philip is saying here in that respect. That and all needs to be looked at carefully. Was it too soon to lay charges against this young lady? Was it appropriate? Is it appropriate to charge her with murder?
That's definitely a legal legal issue. I'm not too sure again how the laws are, but in terms of being able to learn from the experience and work forward and even say what is needed, was this child even expecting, did she have a homicidal thoughts and she said she wanted to kill, or was it we have persons who pyromaniacs, was she accustomed to lighting fires? Was it that how was her anger responded to? Did she have anger management training before to say that, okay, somebody taught her? There's all these things to consider in terms of her developmental health, right? And even the girls around her, how were they reacting to anger? How were they responding? How were their needs taken care of? Were they being well taken care of in this in the school
facility?
Were they being able to learn that and those emotional, healthy coping strategies?
Do you think that those things have to become a fundamental part of the process by which there's going to be investigation and then a court process for this? You think that will be central to that kind of approach has to happen?
I think it definitely needs to be investigated, and any situation where a person is charged, what is going to happen after? Is she just going to be locked up as a 15-year-old? What is going to happen after? Who are we releasing into society after those years of being committed, if she's imprisoned or whatnot? So that is the true aim here. What are we doing with those persons? But the reason for immediacy is that sometimes we do have persons who are charged 10 years later. That dopamine kick, I got away with it. It's less impactful than if it is, I am saying, okay, you did something wrong, and here's the consequences for the behavior, and we're creating a direct relationship between the behavior and the consequence.
Nancy Kipalani, clinical and counseling psychologist, thank you very much for talking with us. That's been 10 Questions. That's our program. This edition, I'm Andy Johnson. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.